guys, so we are starting chapter 10, which is our agricultural unit. So this unit is just chapter 10, and I hope you had a good break and it was nice and restful. I know mine was. I'm still on break making this video for you. So we're going to go over chapter 10, key issue 1. A lot of the mapping things we will be doing in class, so you'll notice there's a lot of maps in the first two sections. So we'll be doing lots of map journaling when you guys get back, which is past tense because you guys are probably already back by the time you're watching this. So anyway, first of all, agriculture. What is it? It's farming. It's just a fancy word for farming. So it's the same thing. Anything where you are getting resources from the earth, you could almost consider that agriculture, so long as it was for the purposes of like food and things like that. Okay. So something that I want to point out to you, this is not in your book, so this is definitely a really important thing to write down, is we tend to classify economic activities. So economic activities are anything where there is an exchange of goods, services, oftentimes in the hopes of making a profit, right? So there are technically 5, but I would say if you know primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, you very rarely would get a question about quaternary economic activities. So primary economic activities are those that deal with the extraction of products. Agriculture, right, is a primary economic activity. So this entire unit is about primary economic activities, and then our next unit is going to deal with secondary and tertiary. Secondary, just to give you a bit of a preview, is taking a product and making it into something, okay? Tertiary is the service industry. I'm going to give you some examples of all of these if you're still confused. Quaternary is tied to information or the exchange of money and goods, okay? And quaternary is tied to research, higher education, and decision making. So here's some examples. When we're talking about economic activities, we're talking about occupations, right? We're talking about what people do for a living. So primary, obviously, lots of those people are going to be farmers, so ranching, hunting, and gathering, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Fishing, forestry, mining. So even though it's like you're not growing rocks, you're still extracting those from the earth. So it's a little bit different than agriculture, but it's still considered a primary economic activity. Secondary is manufacturing. Factories is what we're talking about when we talk about secondary, right? For example, a car company has to get all of those materials, right? Steel, those sorts of things. They're going to get those materials and then they're going to build the car in the factory, right? So that would be a secondary economic activity. Tertiary is anything where you're delivering a service. So a banker, a lawyer, doctor, teacher. I am delivering information to you, right? I'm giving you knowledge. That is my service. Nurses, salespeople, clerks, secretaries, okay? Quaternary are IT specialists, people who work on computers, computer analysts, finance, real estate, okay? Stock market would also be a good example, I think, of quaternary. Quinary has to do with like maybe the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. We would consider that like a quinary type of job. If you are maybe the president of a university, those are a little up there. So something else that you will want to note. LDCs, least developed countries, most of their work is going to be in the primary economic sector, okay? Whereas in more developed countries like the US, most of our jobs are in the tertiary, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit later about kind of how this looks, but this is like for the third world, second world, first world. This is what the type of jobs are. And by the way, these two types of jobs, the quaternary and the quaternary, those are obviously going to be in MDCs, right, and not LDCs. Okay, so there's 3 agricultural revolutions that we're going to be looking at. We're mostly focusing on the first one for today. Remember what that term revolution means, right? It means that there's some sort of change happening. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. The change is we had all of this new machinery to make products a lot quicker, right? And it made people healthier, which is tied to the Agricultural Revolution, which we'll talk about, and we've talked about it in terms of population growth, right? Well, that's very similar to what we're talking about here. So the first agricultural revolution took place in 6000 BC in the Fertile Crescent. I'm going to show you a picture of that in a second. And what changed was people started domesticating animals rather than hunting and gathering. Okay, domesticating is you keep those animals and you use them either for meat or for like pets or for dragging a plow. You keep those animals. Okay, you're making them your own, whereas before all animals were just wild and free. The second agricultural revolution began in Europe in the 1600s. This is very closely tied to the Industrial Revolution. So the Agricultural Revolution takes place, and it really makes the Industrial Revolution possible that comes about a century later. Okay, so this is early mechanization, so using machines instead of just hands and labor to grow things. And closure of fields, which is exactly what it sounds like, just fencing off your fields and saying that this land is mine, your fence is over there, that's yours. So before that, people kind of just used land willy-nilly and there wasn't a lot of organization to it. So once they started enclosing fields, that was a big revolutionary change, okay? Both of these things, the mechanization of farming and enclosure of fields, led to huge increases in food production. And this is really what helped to spur the Industrial Revolution. Okay? The third agricultural revolution, which we'll get to later in the unit, starts in the mid-1950s. It's still going on today. It increases mechanization, so that trend kind of continues from the second Industrial Revolution. But we also start using pesticides, GMOs, which kind of get a bad rap. We'll talk about kind of the pros and cons of GMOs a little bit later. So much more emphasis on these big commercial agricultural operations, right? And less so on a family has their own farm where they grow their own food, okay? We switch to a different type of agriculture. Okay. So we're just going to talk really briefly about what agriculture looks like today, because there's a lot of problems and a lot of controversies that are going to come up a lot during this unit. So the entire world is dealing with soil erosion. So what happens when you plant on a piece of land is the soil gets, you guys know this actually from reading The Grapes of Wrath, the soil gets depleted and it starts to become so nutritionless that you can't grow anything on it. And the way to fix that really is to let it sit there, lie fallow, and let it recover some of its nutrients. But if you absolutely need food, or if the way you make money is by selling food, then it's really hard to let your land do that. So we're dealing with soil erosion all over the world. Only about 3% of the Earth's surface is capable of growing food, and that is not a lot. Loss of farmland due to urban sprawl. So as our cities get bigger and bigger, they're taking away potential farmland, right? Our cities, especially in the US, grow out, right? Whereas some cities like Tokyo now can't grow out anymore, so they grow up. Mechanized farming has led to greater production of food, but we still are not quite making enough food to deal with the growing population, okay? So, I don't know, Thomas Malthus was sort of right, sort of wrong. He didn't expect that we would come up with all of this mechanization to make more food to feed our growing population, but it's not like we have plenty of food to go around. There are plenty of people in this world that are starving, and we're going to talk about why that is a little bit later. Cultivation of land, changes like irrigation, desertification, deforestation, destruction of wetlands, all of those things are changes to the environment. All of those are pretty negative changes to the environment. So the third agricultural revolution, and really what's going on now when it comes to agriculture, is this emphasis on sustainable agriculture. How do we change our practice so that we can grow food for centuries to come? Because the rate we're going, that's not going to happen. Okay. So, just a few more facts here. Soil is eroding at 17 times the rate at which it forms in the U.S. So we are particularly bad at eroding our soil in the U.S. And it is supposed to double in Asia and Africa and South America. So even the third world deals with soil erosion. In order to feed 80 million humans that are going to be added to the population annually, 12 million acres of new land must be put into production. So we are going to have to find a way to get more farmland or to recuperate some of the farmland that we've already lost if we're going to feed all of these people. And so far, as I said, we'll talk about it later, we're not doing a very good job. More than 25 million acres of productive arable land are severely degraded and abandoned worldwide every year. And it just tells you about how big of a space that is. So that's insane that we do that every year. Okay, so let's go back to that first agricultural revolution. Okay, so we're talking about hunters and gatherers first. Oh, I don't know why it's doing that. Oh, okay, so remember this is before 6000 BC. What people did is they were in their groups and they traveled. They were nomads. They didn't have a settlement where they lived and they slept every night. They were constantly on the move because that's the way that you were able to feed yourself. So you had to go hunt. So the men were hunting and fishing to get food. They would bring it back and cook it. The women would go gather like other types of food, berries, roots, plants, things like that. They would eat, and when the food ran out, they would pick up and then they would move on to another location. So that's kind of how life worked for hunters and gatherers. So the first agricultural revolution, also known as the Neolithic Revolution, is when people stopped moving around and they started to take animals and use them for domestic purposes, either for meat or for working the land. So hunting stopped. Like you would just start raising animals for food instead of going out and finding the animals all the time. People started growing things, their own plants, so that the need for gathering also was no longer an issue. So that's the first big change. That's the first agricultural revolution. It's really the invention of agriculture. There really wasn't agriculture before that. Okay, so the agricultural revolution starts here. Okay, this is the Fertile Crescent, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But this map just shows you where some of the early hearths were for these different types of foods. Okay, so yams, as you know, come from Africa, Nigeria, right? Very important. So you don't have to necessarily memorize these. It's more important for you to know that it's not like, now it seems like you can get anything anywhere, but that wasn't true. Like, there's lentils over here. There were no lentils over here. That wasn't something that existed. Does that make sense? Okay. I hope it does. Obviously, you can't talk back to me. This is a close-up of the Fertile Crescent. It's also called Mesopotamia, which you guys have probably heard of. Mesopotamia means land between two rivers, and the two rivers that it is between is the Tigris and the Euphrates. Okay, Tigris, Euphrates. Very fertile land here. This is why so much of early agriculture was built in the Fertile Crescent. Okay, so animal domestication, I do have a map of this, but if you wanted a list, goats, sheep, pigs come from Southwest Asia. They were used for ceremonial purposes. Yes, they were used as pets. People liked having pets even way back then. Scavengers, they would use them for labors, and obviously their meat and their milk. Okay. The uses of animals change over time. You had to think about like how you were going to protect your animals from predators. You also didn't want to have animals that were hard to control, so people had to think about like what are the docile animals that we can handle. Animals used to be bigger a lot of times than they were, but they've been bred in such a way that they've kind of shrunk in size, and that's because of domestication. Kind of crazy. All right, so here's the map. So again, this is the Fertile Crescent, right? And this is where we get a lot of these animals originally. And nothing over here, right? Oh, I should use my pointer for you guys, sorry. So the New World, right? This Western Hemisphere did not have a lot of animals. There were no horses in the area that would become the United States until the Columbian Exchange, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But again, it's not like all animals lived every single location. They came from hearths. It's really important that you guys understand that. So the contributing factors to the first agricultural revolution had to do with climate and cultural preferences. So, and it's very true today. There's a reason California and France are known as wine country. It's because you can grow grapes there because they have a temperate climate. Grapes like it when it's not too cold and it's not too hot. Obviously, you couldn't grow a lot of grapes in Arizona. It gets way too hot for the grapes, right? So a lot of times your climate is going to determine what type of agriculture you engage in. Also, cultural preferences, right? Remember how important yams were to the Nigerian people and things fall apart? That was a cultural preference. Their climate was conducive to yams, but also they served a very important role in their culture. Okay, so what happens in the 1400s, continuing to the 1600s, is, of course, European exploration, which we've talked about a lot. I'm not going to go over it with you here again, but what I'm trying to show you is that this, shoot, bear with me here, y'all. This, the isolation of all of these different crops, ended with the European exploration, because when people travel, they bring different things. Okay, so what we're talking about here essentially is the Columbian Exchange. I'm going to let John Green explain this to you instead of myself. It's only like 5 minutes. Here. Oh. I'm going to skip forward to the 5-minute mark here. He talks really fast, so if you need to replay it a couple times, I would recommend it. Let's see. Okay.
It's about smoking. The first comes from my high school history teacher, Raoul Meyer, who also writes Crash Course. When I was a senior in high school, he walked up to me and he's, I want you to keep smoking. I want you to smoke until the day after your 65th birthday, and then I want you to die so that I collect all of your Social Security. That inspired me, Mr. Meyer, to quit smoking just 8 short years later. Here is an amazing statistic. Cigarettes were handed out to American servicemen during World War II, and more soldiers who started smoking during the war died from smoking than died from the war. So if the New World was looking to extract some measure of revenge for smallpox and measles and chickenpox, mission accomplished. Best wishes, John Green. Now on to animals. American animals like llamas and guinea pigs never really caught on in Eurasia. But imports to the Americas like pigs, cows, and horses were revolutionary. Let's go to the thought bubble. First of all, these animals, especially pigs, completely remade the food supply. Pigs breed really quickly, they eat anything, and they turn into bacon, which made them heroes to the New World, just as today they are heroes to the internet. Here's how quickly pigs breed. When Hernando de Soto arrived in Florida in 1539, he brought 13 pigs. By the time of his death, there were 700. That was 3 years later. The abundance of meat and plentiful land for agriculture and grazing meant that Europeans in the Americas very rarely experienced famine, and despite what you may have learned about religious and political freedom, the main reason Europeans came to America was to eat. Large European animals also changed the nature of work in the Americas. Before Europeans, the largest beast of burden was the llama, and at best it could carry like 100 pounds. This meant that for the long distance travel that the Inca engaged in, the primary transportation animal was Incas. Oxen, when combined with their plows, made it possible to bring more land under cultivation and also made transportation easier and more efficient. And plus, European animals remade culture. The grossly stereotypical American Indian, like from the movies, riding the Great Plains with an eagle feather headdress and war paint, well, he didn't exist before the Columbian Exchange because there were no horses for him to ride. And the introduction of horses allowed many Native Americans to abandon agriculture in favor of a nomadic lifestyle because riding around hunting buffalo made them far richer than farming ever had. Thanks, Thought Bubble. While animals and diseases completely reshaped the New World, it was New World plants that had the biggest effect on Eurasia. Sure, Europeans brought over some crops that we now grow here in the Americas, like wheat and grapes, both of which are necessary for Catholic Mass. But New World plants radically changed the lives of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Africans, Asians, and Europeans, specifically by making pizza possible. I mean, until 500 years ago, Italians lived without tomatoes, without modern pizza or marinara sauce or pizza or ketchup or pizza or even pizza. Indians lived without curry, which contains chilies, a New World food. Persians lived without corn, which is a New World food, as are beans and potatoes and avocados and peanuts and blueberries. The list goes on and on. And these New World crops led to probably the greatest population increase in history. To quote Crosby, "It is crudely true that if man's caloric intake is sufficient, he will somehow stagger to maturity, and he will reproduce." And New World food was far more caloric than Old World food, which is the central reason that the world population doubled between 1650 and 1850. Plants like corn and potatoes could grow in soils that were useless for Old World crops. Potatoes were actually introduced to Europe as an aphrodisiac, but it turns out that you have to distill those potatoes into vodka before they have the desired effect. Anyway, if potatoes are an aphrodisiac, the Irish quickly became the hottest people on earth. An acre and a half of potato cultivation could feed an Irish family for a year, and the average Irish worker often ate 10 pounds of potatoes every day. Surviving primarily on potatoes, the Irish more than doubled their population between 1754 and 1845 when the potato famine showed up and ruined everything. And it wasn't just Europe. Manioc or cassava is a New World plant with roots that provide more calories than any other plant on Earth, provided they are properly processed, otherwise they're poisonous. Manioc is so prevalent in Africa that many Africans swear the plant is native to the continent, but it isn't. Nor are sweet potatoes, and while New World grains never replaced rice in Southeast or East Asia, the sweet potato is so common that it is known as the poor person's staple in China. Even in Japan, the tomb of the farmer who is reputed to have first brought them to the islands is known as the Temple of the Sweet Potato. And it's also worth noting that corn, while it may not feature prominently in European diets, has been the central source of food for animals in Europe for centuries. And in fact, that's still the case. In 2005, 58% of the corn grown in America went to animal feed, is the kind of thing you learn when you live in Indiana. All right, so last but not least, the Columbian Exchange involved the transfer of lots of people. Again, in the early stages, this movement was mostly one way, with Europeans and Africans, the Africans usually against their will, making their way to the Americas. So the Columbian Exchange led to the repopulation of the New World following the disease devastation of the initial encounter, and better nutrition allowed the population of the Old World to grow, which in turn placed population pressure on Eurasia, which led to more people coming to the Americas. In the process, the world's human inhabitants became more genetically and ethnically interconnected, but it also led to the horrors of Atlantic slavery, which we'll be discussing next week. What are we to make of the Columbian Exchange? It devastated the population of the Americas, it led to the widespread slavery of Africans, but it also allowed for a worldwide population increase, and the lives of some natives, including plains tribes like the Lakota, became better and more secure, at least for...
Okay, so I think I'm going to stop it there. So let's go back to... Oh, what's going on here? Anyways, I was just going to sum it up here anyway. So the Columbian Exchange was basically this, first it's the transfer of people, but then where those people are coming from. They have crops that are unique to that area. They start bringing them to the New World, and vice versa. There are things in the New World that never existed in the Old World, and they switch back and forth, right? The Native Americans take horses, and it completely revolutionizes the way that they live their lives. Yeah, and this is where we start to get food that never existed in places before showed up. The Irish are another really great example that he gives you. But basically, this led to more food, and whenever there is more food, you get more people. Why? Because maternal mortality rates go down because women are being well fed. Infant mortality rates go down because babies are born healthier. And there are less people dying of starvation, right? So as food increased, so did the population, and then that kind of leads us into the second agricultural revolution, which we will talk about in the next little video. All right, welcome back. I know that was kind of a long one, but this is kind of a doozy of a chapter. There's lots of information. You will notice on your calendar you have longer breaks between due dates for these things, so you could do notes for a night, you could do lecture for a night, so I'm just going to warn you the lectures are going to tend to be a little bit longer just because lots of content to get through. Okie doke. Bye-bye.